Straight up. Let's get into our Genesis study. I got kind of into Proverbs and I just kept going there, but let's get into our Genesis study for the last 2 segments. You want to? And then we'll pick up where we left off in Proverbs next Tuesday. Okay? We are in Genesis chapter 44 and verse 14. I love this study in Genesis. Genesis 44:14. Let's see. 44:14. This is a great part of Joseph's story. We're about to wrap up Joseph's story. And this is a really cool story. The last time when we left off here in chapter 44, Joseph had brought his brothers back. They had come back with Benjamin, and he was very happy to see Benjamin, but he did not reveal his identity to them. He put a golden cup of his in Benjamin's sack because he was going to keep Benjamin. He wanted to see if his brothers would fight for one of their brothers or if they would give him up. And so we are in chapter 44 and verse 14. And Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground. So what has happened is Joseph sent the soldiers and he said, search all their sacks. And he said, I'm going to give you this one too. He said, and they searched them and they found the cup in Benjamin's sack. And Benjamin didn't steal it. Joseph had put it in there and sent the soldiers. He wanted to be able to keep Benjamin. Because when the soldiers came and said, why would you steal from your master? And they had told him, with whosoever of thy servants it be found. So they're so certain that they have not stolen anything because that's not what they do. They're so certain. They said that in verse 9, with whomsoever of thy servants it be found, both let him die, and we also will be my Lord's bondmen. He says, if you find something stolen among our things, kill the culprit, and all the rest of us will be your servants. They are that certain that they are not stealing anything. So in verse 14, and Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground. They're freaked out because, the cup was found in Benjamin's bag after they said, kill the culprit, and the rest of us will be your slaves. In verse 15, and Joseph said unto them, what deed is this that ye have done? Wot ye not that such a man as I can certainly divine? He says, don't you know that I can tell and I already know who has stolen from me? In verse 16, and Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also with whom the cup is found. So they're just distraught. In verse 17 of chapter 44 in Genesis, and he said, God forbid that I should do so, but the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my servant. And as for you, get you up in peace unto your father. So now they're freaked out because their father Jacob was not willing to let Benjamin go. He was afraid something would happen to him, just like it happened to Joseph in the hands of his brothers. And so now this Egyptian governor is telling the sons of Jacob, I'm going to keep Benjamin and you guys can go home. And they're like, we can't do that. In verse 18, then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant. For thou art even as Pharaoh. He's acknowledging, Judah is acknowledging the power of this governor of Egypt, who he doesn't recognize as his brother Joseph. In verse 19, my Lord asked his servants, saying, have ye a father or a brother? And we have said unto my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, a little one, and his brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother, and his father loveth him. And thou saidst unto thy servants, bring him down unto me, that I may set my eyes upon him. And we said unto my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Because they have already injured Jacob terribly. He never recovered from what he thought was Joseph's death. In verse 23, and thou saidst unto thy servants, except your youngest brother come down with you, ye shall see my face no more. So it was a dilemma, and they had to bring Benjamin in order to get Simeon back and to get food to sustain them. In verse 24, and it came to pass when we came up unto thy servant my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, go again and buy us a little food. And we said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother be with us, then we will go down, for we may not see the man's face except our youngest brother be with us. In verse 27, and thy servant my father said unto us, ye know that my wife bare me 2 sons. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I saw him not since. He's talking about Joseph dying, see. In verse 29, and if ye take this also from me, and mischief befall him, ye shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. So Joseph had told them, if anything happens to Benjamin, I'm just going to die. I'm going to keel over and die. In verse 30, now therefore, when I come to thy servant my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life, it shall come to pass when he seeth that the lad is not with us, that he will die. And thy servants shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father. He's saying, I guaranteed his safety with my own life, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord. He's saying, Judah is saying, I'll be your servant. Please let Benjamin go. I will stay in his place and be your servant for the rest of my life. And I will take his place. And let the lad go up with his brethren. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me? Lest peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father. So Judah is totally freaked out here. He's like, okay, take me instead. I give you my life. Please let Benjamin go. Now we're going to go into chapter 45 of Genesis and verse 1. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. He could not hold it back anymore. And he cried. Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. So he caused everybody who wasn't one of his brothers to leave the room. And he told his brothers who he was. In verse 2, and he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. In verse 3, and Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. They're like, oh my gosh, this is Joseph. We're totally, we're toast. In verse 4, and Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land. And yet there are 5 years, in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. He's saying, the famine's been here 2 years already, and there's another 5 years of famine ahead. In verse 7, and God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, to save their lives, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. In verse 8, so now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all of his house. So he's saying, you guys, yeah, you were jerks, but it wasn't really you that did what you did. It was God who led you to do what you did. Remember, it is written. Everything is written. And a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. In verse 9, haste ye, and go up to my father, and say unto him, thus saith thy son Joseph, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not. That means don't wait to come down, come now. In verse 10, and thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. In verse 11, and there will I nourish thee, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. He's saying, bring everything, all of your tribe, all of your families, all of your animals, everything you own, and bring it here so I can take care of you through the next 5 years of the famine and make sure you live through it. In verse 12, and behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. In verse 13, and ye shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that ye have seen. And ye shall haste and bring down my father hither. So he's saying, go back and get him, get everything, and come back again. In verse 14, and he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. So Benjamin had not been a part of what happened to Joseph. And so there was no ill feelings between Benjamin and Joseph at all. And they loved one another. In verse 15, moreover, he kissed all of his brethren and wept upon them. He was happy to see them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come. And it pleased Pharaoh well and his servants. In verse 17, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, say unto thy brethren, this do ye, lade your beasts and go, get you unto the land of Canaan. He's saying, take your animals and the food and go back to where your father is. And verse 18, and take your father and your households and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat the fat of the land. So Pharaoh is affirming that he wants to permit Joseph's entire family, entire tribe basically, to come back into Egypt, and they would be protected from the famine by Pharaoh himself and by the governor of Egypt, their brother. In verse 19, now thou art commanded this, do ye. Take you wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. So he's giving them wagons to take back with them to make their journey easier to come back. In Genesis chapter 45, verse 20, also regard not your stuff, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours. He's saying, if anything that's junk, leave it. Don't regard it, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours. In verse 21, excuse me, and the children of Israel, that's Jacob, did so. And Joseph gave them wagons according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provision for the way. In verse 22, to all of them he gave each man changes of raiment, that's clothing. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing. So he has really just been pouring blessings on Benjamin. And to his father he sent after this manner, 10 asses laden with the good things of Egypt, and 10 she-asses laden with corn and bread and meat for his father by the way. So he sent them food to make the journey. He sent them good things, presents and things like that for his father. In verse 24, so he sent his brethren away, and they departed. And he said unto them, see that ye fall not out by the way. He's saying, don't stop anywhere and linger there. Hightail it back and then get right back as quickly as possible. In verse 25, and they went up out of Egypt and came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob their father. Wow, I bet that was a tough confession, don't you think? Because they had to tell their father that they sold him. They had to tell their father what happened. In verse 26, and told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. He didn't believe them. In verse 27, and they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said unto them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. I'm about to cry. Why am I crying? It's just such a cool story. The spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. He was so sorrowful ever since Joseph died, ever since he thought Joseph died, that he had just been sorrowful ever since. But now he is told that his son is alive and is governor of Egypt and wants them all to come. And it says, the spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. I can't help but cry. I mean, I'm sitting here crying about this because, losing his son just nearly killed him. And he had been sad ever since. And suddenly, to hear that his son was alive and that he was governor of Egypt and that had sent for them. I'm sorry. I'm like crying like a baby, aren't I? Good thing it's only a couple minutes to the break because I'm a mess. The spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. His son was alive. That is the best news he could have ever received in his whole life. And he revived. His spirit revived. He was encouraged. He was hopeful. He was happy. And he hadn't been ever since he thought he'd lost Joseph. In verse 28, and Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. That is the only thing that mattered to him at that time, that his son was alive. I'm a mess. And Israel said, it is enough. Israel, that's Jacob. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. And so he was revived and thrilled and happy and hopeful once again, and he hadn't been ever since he'd lost Joseph. And he is excited to go and see his son. And glory to God. I mean, isn't that an amazing story? It's very touching to me because I really get into this story and I feel it when I study. I feel these things like, I'm on the inside of me. It makes me cry because I can just feel how sorrowful he had been ever since he had lost Joseph. And then all of a sudden to hear that Joseph was alive just totally revived him, revived his spirit. He wasn't sorrowful anymore. That was the only thing that he could ever hear in his life that would have revived him. And that's what he heard. That's what he heard. Troy, can you go ahead and take us to the break? We're at the bottom of the hour and I am a mess now. So I'm going to... And then when we come back after the break, we'll go into chapter 46 of the book of Genesis in verse 1 and start there. Yeah, we'll be back.